Hi, I'm Rachel, and this is my 2026 Maybe Midrash Readathon wrap-up video. So, Maybe Midrash was started on BookTube by Jason at Old Blues Chapters and Verse a handful of years back. For a couple of years, he had some co-hosts among the BookTube community, and the purpose of the Readathon was to pick two books individually. One serious work of fiction and one serious work of nonfiction pertaining to any world religion. And this fits into my wheelhouse quite nicely as somebody who reads a lot of Jewish literature and is always keen to read more, especially with a title like Maybe Midrash. Midrash is a very central theme in religious Judaism. So anyway, I'll link to my TBR video that I made for this year down below. Maybe Midrash I don't think happened in any official capacity this year, but of course this could be a self-guided readathon, so I'm having fun. And this year I focused very much on the holiday of Passover, a very important, one of the most important holidays on the Jewish calendar. Beyond reading, I also went to a concert because part of Maybe Midrash in later years was, well, technically you were supposed to maybe see a serious movie or do a book club, but I didn't do either of those. I went to a concert by the Maccabeats, and I related this to Passover because my favorite one of their parody songs is a Les Miserables Passover parody, which they did not sing during this set, even though they did sing songs about Hanukkah and Purim, which both weren't seasonally appropriate either, but they never got to Passover. But despite all of that, it was a really fun concert. They have an active, fan group, really around the country. I think they're pretty famous in Jewish circles, and I even recorded a little bit of one of their songs, and I put my Jewish DC blog post up, which I'll link down below. Okay, well, now getting into the serious literature part of this wrap-up. I'm going to start by recapping my fiction pick. This is The Midwives' Escape from Egypt to Jericho by Maggie Anton, and I think this would be literally a piece of modern midrash where she is taking the biblical story of Exodus and telling it from a different angle. Particularly, she is talking about where she created two Egyptian midwives that she, mother and a daughter, she named Asenath and Shifra. And they were part of the mixed multitudes of the Bible who went with the Israelites or the Hebrews after the plagues. They followed Moses and the Hebrews and Elohim out of Egypt and toward the Promised Land, although first they had to wander for 40 years. And we're seeing all of this from the perspective of these two Egyptian women who very easily take on the mantle of, following these people and following Elohim. Perhaps arguably a little too easily. Some of my biggest problems with this book was I don't think the characterization was all that deep. In fact, when it comes to these two POVs, sometimes I couldn't tell the difference between them at all. And all of the characterization was relatively shallow, pretty one-dimensional. Interestingly enough, I think the hints of deeper characterization were for biblical characters who are much more central in the original story, namely Moses, the prophet, and his brother, the high priest Aaron. We don't see it directly from their perspective, but this book has a lot of gossip, basically, and from that gossip, we actually inflect a little bit of nuance and complexity to these two brothers and their relationship based on what Asenath and Shifra and their families overhear and gossip about. And I do appreciate the idea that, they're telling the actual story in the form of gossip because, it just seems like something that might be central to the experience of women over their looms. And also, there's a lot of, female tasks that are much more central in this book than are central in the biblical story. We get a lot of details about preparing food and preparing other important artifacts of, living in the wilderness. It's all very kind of dry and, and not entirely compelling within the narrative, although in a research way, I actually am very intrigued as someone who's writing a Jewish-inspired fantasy with Iron Age-esque influence, so I might be taking some notes, so I appreciate that. My favorite part of this really is the emphasis on the mixed multitudes, on these outsiders to the Hebrew community, which who with time and even before the Exodus are infiltrating in the community. And I think this talks or speaks to how ancient tribal affiliations went, and like they weren't all completely separate, and there was a lot of intermarrying and interculturalism, which is nice to read about, especially in the modern day. Judaism tends to be a bit separate and a bit apart in ways, and maybe dismissive of interfaith realities in ways that aren't true in this book, and maybe not true in a lot of, actual biblical understanding of society. So I liked that part, but in general, I thought the book wasn't all that well written, so it was a little bit disappointing in that way. That being said, I said this is a Passover story, and it starts with Passover, which is the Exodus from Egypt, but then it goes further into the narrative because there's the revelation, Elohim's revelation at Mount Sinai, and then we chronicle the 40 years. The timeline isn't all that great in here, but we do chronicle the 40 years of wandering in the desert. And so that takes us further into, biblical history, which is recounted in Jewish religious spaces every year. So actually, as I am filming this, yesterday on Shabbat, one of my rabbis in her sermon brought up a line about Moses' father-in-law and why he might have decided to leave Moses and not go to the promised land with him. And so that was really pretty fun, as I was actually, thinking so much about this book. And that question actually comes up in the book, or at least, if not directly, well, there is an answer to it, I think, that Anton goes into. So I thought I would read from that. And this is from the POV of Asenet, and it starts with, "The next day, Merati, who was Asenet's husband, told me that Jericho, Moses' father-in-law, had watched as Moses spent all day judging the people's disputes. Finally, when Moses was finished, Jethro told Moses that he would surely wear himself out, and these people as well. He urged Moses to seek out capable individuals who fear Elohim, trustworthy ones who spurn ill-gotten gain, and let them judge the people. Jethro is a wise man," I said. "I hope Moses heeded his counsel." "He did," Merati sighed. Then, to my surprise, Moses bade farewell to Jethro, who then took his daughter and grandsons back to Midian. "Surprised," I blurted out. "I'm shocked that Moses didn't even share a meal with his wife and sons. He just sent them back to Midian. What kind of leader sets such a poor example of how to treat his family?" I soon learned that many Hebrews were pleased that Moses had apparently divorced his foreign wife. Others, especially those like Shaul, who had married Egyptians, were angry at Moses or felt sympathy for Zipporah, who's Moses' wife, or both. Pua and I both suspected that Aaron was behind the separation and felt sorry for all four of the victims of his machinations, Moses, Zipporah, and their two sons. So yeah, in a way I have to eat my hat a little bit, I suppose it is, because there is that thread of the Hebrew stubbornness against foreigners, although it's not, entire. Maybe it's like in the upper echelons of people who were upset that their prophet was taking a foreign wife, but otherwise there's a lot of intermarriage. But the major thing I wanted to point out in here was the idea of Jethro leaving also with his daughter and grandsons because Moses' brother Aaron was so inhospitable to them. And that kind of speaks to some things that come up later in the story about Aaron's resentment towards Moses, because Aaron's the firstborn son, but he doesn't get to be the major prophet. And also maybe Aaron is trying to put a wedge between the families so that his sons can become Moses' heirs, which actually does happen. And then also there's a little bit in here that's explored a little later about how deep in his heart, Moses is like a wannabe shepherd. He wants to go back to Midian as well. And that's, be a shepherd with Zipporah and all of that. And that's his, he has this internal desire that can't be realized because he has to be this prophet toward the people, and he's pushing himself too hard, and even with having to hear their complaints. So yeah, I really enjoyed that, part of the story. Next, I'm turning to my nonfiction pick, which is The Passover Haggadah, a biography by Vanessa L. Oakes. So, I just came from the Exodus story, which is, mythology and a founding narrative of the peoplehood of Israel. But Passover has been commemorated for over 2,000 years by the Hebrews turned Jews, etc. It's a real thing. It started in temple times in ancient Israel, which it was a huge pilgrimage holiday where masses of people would flock to Jerusalem and to the Holy Temple, and the Levites would be overseeing, and those would be the high priests, aka, they're mythologically, Aaron's descendants, would be overseeing the big sacrifices. And that lasted, of course, until the diaspora and Temple Judaism went away. And then there's this big thing about how to commemorate Passover. And it turns into, certainly the religious aspects of peoplehood become much more important. But then there's a bigger question about how to commemorate it. And, for several centuries, it's just sort of an oral tradition of passing down the memory until maybe around the 9th century CE, and the Jewish community is clamoring for some sort of unifying text, which ultimately they get. And then, of course, the advent of printing and the proliferation of printing and different interpretations comes to bear, especially flowering in the 20th and 21st centuries. And the fascinating thing about the Haggadah is that it's much less strict than other Jewish texts. There's a lot of Torah rules about, how the Torah is read every Shabbat and at other times, or like how the Scroll of Esther has to be read for Purim, which is actually a much less important holiday, technically speaking. But the Haggadah is a lot more kind of do-it-your-own pace sort of thing. I mean, the major impetus is to remember the history and to pass it down to your children. But generally speaking, there aren't a lot of rules for how the Haggadah has to be made or exactly how you have to remember it. So the whole idea of how diverse Haggadot have become, especially in modern years, like here's my Harry Potter Haggadah right over there, it kind of tracks. There's less traditional pushback to that, I think. But yeah, it's been a fascinating road. This book goes into medieval Haggadot, which were these beautiful illuminated manuscripts that were owned by wealthy families, but even they started to speak to modern day realities of struggling with the anti-Semitism of their day. And then ultimately things started to really, I guess, shift significantly in the 20th century with the major turning points for the Jewish people, which would be the Holocaust and the State of Israel, and how those events came into modern Haggadot, but also there was pushback against that about, how much of sort of our modern understanding of Jewish history should infiltrate this mythological story, which is a founding origin story and technically is still much bigger than even these huge events of the 20th century, especially since divine intervention is so clearly on the page in Exodus and is not clearly, on the page in modern times. So there's a lot of really fascinating stuff in here, and I really enjoyed this read. And since this is maybe Midrash, I thought I would read from a section that goes into Midrash, which is reinterpretation of the Torah, which came into play even with the most early Haggadot. And so, Midrashic activity happened after, Temple Judaism and the diaspora. So anyway, one known consequence of Midrashic activity that appears in the Haggadah is the passage about the 4 sons who ask about the meaning of Passover. Feminist interventions in recent Haggadot have rendered these archetypal characters as both sons and daughters, or as children. The Bible makes it clear that the parent is responsible to teach and transmit the memory of Exodus. It is the core curriculum for cultural reproduction. That said, why does the Bible state this 4 times and in different ways? Midrash accounts for these redundancies not only by justifying them, but, in the process, also imparting a lesson well known to the best teachers. If you want your teaching to be effective, you have to adapt your curriculum to where your students are at. Making this point, the Midrashic imagination creates 4 different sons, each with a different character. The wise, the wicked, the simple, in some sources he was downright stupid, and the one whose mind is such a tabula rasa that he doesn't even know how to formulate, let alone pose, a question. While the Haggadah will claim that the Torah actually refers to these 4 children who ask about the meaning of Passover, no such figures actually exist. So yeah, this is a reminder about how much Midrash can move beyond the source material until you forget what's actually in the source material. I mean, the Torah is a very small book in comparison to generations of Jewish exegesis about it in the Mishnah and the Midrash and the Gemara, etc. So yeah, I found that fascinating because, the 4 children is a seminal part of the Haggadah. It's existed in most Haggadot for centuries and centuries. And yet here's the reminder that actually it is a midrashic interpretation of tell your children, and how, it's explained in 4 different ways in the Torah, but that doesn't mean that the children of the Haggadah are actually in the Torah. So yeah, this is a lot of geeky fun right here, I told you. And that about covers it for me now. I'm very excited because I finally have some reviews to link down below in case you'd like more information about these books. And I'll link down to the Maccabeats website in case you're interested in that as well. I'm actually still a bit slow on writing and getting up my May reading reviews, but it is time to go into June reading. And as such, stay tuned. In the next couple of days, I'll have up my June page 112 tag TBR video, which I have actually pre-filmed because I get so excited about it. Anyway, I do want to take the moment to thank Jason so much for bringing this experience to BookTube, and I've been having a lot of fun with it. I think this experience in particular, and focusing on Passover, is sort of the most genuine I've been to the idea of Midrash and, actually interacting with the Bible in new ways and interacting with Jewish ritual in new ways as well. So I'm very grateful to that. And it actually was a kind of difficult month, May. I had, this readathon, I had the BookTube prize, and I did a bunch of other reading as well, but I am very happy. I think I got a lot out of this month, and hoping I'll get a lot out of June as well. And I hope you feel the same about your reading. So thanks so much for watching, everyone, and I'll see you next time.